this afternoon. Thanks for coming out on this rainy afternoon. My name is Jennifer Dorr, and I'm the co-founder and chair of the Open Book, Open Mind series at Montclair Public Library. When Mr. Dave Jones and I, he's right there, started this series in 2015, one of our goals was to bring incredible debut writers to the attention of Montclair readers. But in this case, the community brought a new writer to me. A good friend of mine put Estep Nagy's book, debut novel, We Shall Not All Sleep, into my hands. And after reading one chapter, it was clear I wanted him in the series. We Shall Not All Sleep is the story of two powerful families and their lives on Seven Island, a retreat from the ordinary world that's rife with privilege, tradition, and tension. The book is set against the backdrop of the Cold War and anti-communism. The New Yorker has said of the novel, Nagy deftly captures the way a political atmosphere of mistrust and manipulation can color even the most private interactions. Estep is also the writer and director of The Broken Giant, an independent feature film in the permanent collection of the Museum of Modern Art, and his plays have been produced across the world. It was Estep who told me that his friend, Garth Hallberg, had moved to Montclair, at which point I wondered aloud, very aloud, if we could get him too. Please, 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 please. Garth Hallberg is the author of the international bestseller, City of Fire, a novel Stephen King has called Dickensian, massively entertaining, and as close to a great American novel as this century has produced. The book takes you deep into New York in the 70s, and it won't let you go. Especially if you like the punk scene. That was, whew, I should have known. Mr. Hallberg is also the author of the recently reissued novella, A Field Guide to the North American Family. The New York Times Book Review has said of the novella, there is some gorgeous image or turn of phrase on every page. Both of these writers are masters at creating intricate worlds filled with familial drama and setting so realistic and detailed they make you feel like you've been there. Both will sign their books at the Watch on Bookseller table in the lobby after the event, and we hope you'll pick up copies. This will be a mutual interview between two guys who are pretty good friends, from what I understand. And thank you so much for donating your time to the library.
Well, thank you so much for coming out. It's such an honor to be here, and we moved to Montclair 2 years ago, coming up on almost exactly. And it has just been nothing but great, and to feel supported by the local library is about as good as it gets, certainly for me. So the fact that all of you bothered to come out on kind of dodgy weather to support debut author, at least to me, and Garth has a little more experience, but is just a wonderful thing, so thank you. We had a conversation about how we would do this, and I think what we decided was that we would each come up with, we would pick passages for each other from our books and kind of give a justification for why we had chosen them, and then use that as a way into a conversation about backgrounds and so forth. Does that sound right to you?
I think so.
Yeah, okay, all right. But maybe one thing to do, I mean, because certainly none of you know me, but maybe we'll start with, I have a passage from Garth's book, City on Fire, very much in mind, but do you want to maybe give a quick sketch of your background, how you arrived here in Montclair? Or?
Well, we did very little research. We were sort of impulse arrivals here. We were out one day in the fall of 2016, and I had literally never been to an open house before. So we were coming out from Brooklyn, and my wife said, "Oh, there's an open house," and the fiction writer in me thought, that's material. I want to know about the New Jersey real estate mafia. That sounds compelling to me. So I show up with my notebook at hand, and as we're looking around, I was like, I kind of like this house. Maybe we should move out here. So we did. So it was a great thrill, having done so little research. And I should say, I think we closed on the house the Friday after the election, which was an interesting experience. What have we just done? But the first time I came to this library, not knowing what I was in for, was a moment of going, okay, yes, this is going to be okay, because this place is really special, and it's such a pleasure to be here, and I think it's been like not even, just over 12 months that we've been up here. And so it's very good of you to have me here today.
Yeah. I mean, we were coming up on 2 years, and for me, I grew up in Philadelphia, went to college in New England, and I lived in Manhattan for 15 years, and then in Brooklyn for another 5, and so I really had, I'm going to confess this to you, I had very dark views of New Jersey from both sides, from the New York side and from the Philadelphia side, and so it was with some trepidation that I also went to an open house thinking, all right, well, let's just rule this out, right? And we turned off of I guess it was Orange Street onto Llewellyn, and I remember thinking, I said this to my wife, I said, wait a minute, this is really nice. and frankly, it's just gotten nicer and nicer. So we had a baby since we got here, and if that had happened in Brooklyn, I think it would have led to real problems. So thanks for having us. So I'm going to start by asking Garth about a particular passage from City on Fire. I guess I don't really know how much. I feel like I've known about City on Fire for years because I have, but I don't know how much you know about it. So I'll give you my quick synopsis of it. It is an epic of many things. It's an epic of New York. It's an epic of the 70s. It's an epic of a particular kind of New York. It's an epic of downtown. It's an epic of uptown. I mean, I think it's actually not too much, I think, to say that it's an epic of the American spirit. I think there's a lot of that in it as well. It manages to be both gritty and ethereal, and its business, the business end of it, takes place between December of 1976 and July of 1977, although there are kind of shouts and murmurs in other places. It is about a couple of different groups of people who wind up finding themselves in the same, I don't want to call it caper, that doesn't sound quite right, but in the same, involved in the same crime. And I guess that I want to start by asking you to read this particular passage that is on page 421. This book is 907 pages long, so this is almost...
But read moves very fast.
It feels like 750 It's on 420, so it's almost the exact midpoint. But before you read it, and I'm very anxious to hear you read it, because as I said to you, this feels to me kind of like a really gripping rhythm, and such a very kind of Garth rhythm in the best possible way. But could you give your synopsis of the book?
My synopsis of the book is that it's, bleak house with a punk rock soundtrack. So I'm a great lover of the 19th century, social novel, and the way it kind of provides an X-ray of a city or a cross section. You kind of can see all of the different social strata and how they relate. And I noticed in my reading of Dickens and Dostoevsky that a lot of the propulsion of these books is that they're, if you look closely enough, they're murder mysteries. So I'm thinking Bleak House, the crime is like, am I mixing this up? No, so someone does spontaneously combust in Bleak House, which is always a good thing to do as an author if you get stuck. It's just spontaneous combustion.
Disappointing absence, actually.
But no, it's the murder of the lawyer, which is at the center. And Brothers Karamazov has the murder of the father at the center. So this was sort of, on some level, among the things it was, is my attempt to kind of do that for New York City at what I found to be this fascinating transitional time, the mid-70s, at which point a world is dying, which is sort of the thrilling, optimistic, prosperous post-war New York, and another world is being born, which is basically ends up being the world we live in. And that's my little synopsis. So when you emailed me this passage, which seemed to you very central, I was like, God, which passage is that again? I've never read this one, so this was exciting for me. But I literally couldn't even remember who was.
Well, he did say to me, he said surprise me, so I'm sort of delighted.
Yeah, you surprised me. I have a lot of surprising things to say about this. So anyway, without further ado, This is two characters, one who seem to come from very different walks of life. One of them's a kind of all-purpose fixer for an investment bank, and one is the leader of a troupe of punk rock squatters, and they're coming together and having a conversation. The windows in those days had been blocked only by dust and pollen. An even golden light filled the room they sat down in, saturated the boy's strong chin, his raw-boned features, and underneath, his air of quick intelligence. An ape of God was the phrase that occurred. As a child smarter than the rest, he must, like Amory, have been subject to schoolyard taunts. But with the total stillness of the house and the heat, the casements were open an inch or two. It felt as if they were beyond all that, beyond time. Something shifted in the boy's expression. Hands on knees, he leaned forward. Holy shit, Billy's uncle. You're the demon brother, aren't you? Amory had found the nickname distasteful when it first reached him, but then he'd seen the beauty of it. It was a giant puppet, a white screen he could hold over his head. The fear, the desire, others would supply. What he proposed to Nicholas was a kind of wager. Charges dropped, records sealed, the boy could resume his arson campaign, though this time in the already smoldering Bronx. And provided he kept within boundaries Amory defined, he could be sure the police would not stop him. Budget cuts had left holes in their deployments. Indeed, Amory had access to the triage plan and would pass along certain sites and times where the game could be pursued with immunity, he said. Or I understand you studied social science? Think of it as a test of competing theories. When the last claimants to the torched acreage had been driven out for urban renewal, per Amory, or when the spectacle of the system's neglect finally galvanized the underclass, per Nicholas, it would be clear whose vision of human nature had won. Whatever the case, Nicholas would get to stay on in the house. Amory had taken the liberty of having a corporate investor from south of the border secure the deed.
I mean, one of the things that's interesting to me about this particular passage is that it is kind of the kind of encapsulation of the crime, right? Here there is an investment bank from the city that is systematically prompting a gang of people who live in a squat, kind of a punk rock squat, who actually are in a band, to burn down buildings, basically, and then take them over, right? Have a declared blight zone. That's the kind of the crux of the...
Right, which is, so I had, early on after I moved to New York, there was like a 5-alarm fire in Williamsburg or Bushwick. And it was speculated that this had been set as part of an insurance fraud. Like it was arson. It was like it's you know, how can a building this big go up so quickly, and you're in this neighborhood that's rapidly gentrifying. And then there was some discussion on public radio about how this was like a long-standing tradition in New York, is landlords paying, you know, to set the fire and collect the insurance. And that's the way that connected with kind of the destructive and creative energies of the gentrifying city seemed very interesting to me. And what I did here was kind of blow it up or exaggerate it, because I was interested in this idea of, you know, what seemed to be opposing forces actually working together.
Yeah, I mean, I love a lot about this passage. I mean, I love the idea of somebody coming from uptown. I mean, anyone ever been to a punk rock squat? Like, believe it or not, I have. And the idea of somebody in a tie.
It still exists.
Do they? There used to be a place called The Crypt in Philadelphia that had amazing shows in the basement. Incredibly unsafe. But somebody in a tie walking into one of these places and sort of confronting, trying to do a deal here with, obviously, well, on the one hand, he has superior resources. On the other hand, they have a certain kind of like belief in what they're doing. I mean, and I guess that was one question I had. I mean, Do you have particular sympathy with either of these? I mean, I feel like there's a lot of energy in the kind of the post-humanist kind of the theology of the punk rock guys, but there's also a lot of energy, I think, in the kind of capitalist inevitabilities of the people who live on the Upper East Side. And that's for me one of the great things about the book is how these things kind of clash and kind of run along. And I guess I'd be curious to know where you come to these two kinds of things from.
Well, I should say, so I hate this passage. That's a full confession. This is one of the last things that was written in the book.
Thanks for coming.
And it was at the behest of, I think, not my American editor, but my British editor. He really wanted access to the bad guy's consciousness. I was of the opinion at that point that a great novel needed a great villain. Like, you gotta have a villain in there. If you're gonna drive the reader through 900 pages. And I also thought there's not enough real evil in American literature. This was during the Iraq War, and Dick Cheney had come to like sort of fascinate me as a possible fictional figure, and I thought, what book can I find him in? So the villain became a figure of intrigue for some early readers of the novel, and he never really got his point of view until like the very end. And I thought, okay, doing this in the middle of the book is a way to also solve certain informational problems, because if you don't have, his point of view, then you have to get a lot of things across to the reader through indirection, and this will just solve a lot of those problems. But it was a real bear of a scene to write, because sometimes when you leave things off the page and they seem improbable, the reader sort of goes with it. When you're actually putting on the page this guy in the tie walking into the squat and saying, okay, I'm going to make you this deal, selling that to the reader is really hard. So that's all sort of by way of preface. But my sympathies in the, actually interaction with these two characters, it's like a lot of my sympathy is with, the punks and the dispossessed and, the people who are critics of the capitalist order and the thing that the city is becoming. But what I was kind of seeing in New York was, and especially in, this time of just rapid change in the city. I guess it's always a time of rapid change in the city, but, what happened to Williamsburg, what happened to Bushwick between, the first time I went there in 1997 and now is just astonishing. And I thought, it's not enough to be hip. It's not enough to be, to read the right books and to, wear the oppositional eccentric outfits, because all you're doing in some way is paving the way for the real estate developers. And on the flip side of that, I started out kind of mentally in opposition to the real estate developers, one of whom is now our president. But you come to realize that a lot of the stuff that you love about New York City, if you revere the Woolworth Building, or you revere the New York Public Library, you revere Carnegie Hall, in some ways those are all, excrudescences of great, commercial booms. And so I think all that gets to is that my idea of the way a novelist thinks is that a novelist thinks dialectically. Everything is always kind of turning into its opposite, and you're always finding yourself in sympathy with things that you started out writing in opposition to, and taking a more ironic or critical stance towards the things that you wholeheartedly embrace. And so that's the magic of fiction for me, is it allows you to kind of think thoughts that are bigger than your own biases and preconceptions. But
now I feel like I have to justify this choice.
well, no.
But I will bring it around to my book, and you're very generous to go back to it. But I will say this: like the thing that struck me about this passage is just what you said, really. And it's funny because one of the pieces of my book that came the easiest, and I feel the best about in some ways, is one that I also was basically forced to write by an editor, by circumstances, but. The windows in those days had been blocked only by dust and pollen, and even golden light filled the room. They sat down in saturated voice, strong chin, his raw-boned features, and underneath his air of quick intelligence. An ape of God was the phrase that occurred. I love the way you change speeds. Like that is a thing that feels very, very idiomatic to you. And I think it's great, and it reminds me of the sentence that brought this sort of outrageous smile to my face when I opened the book for the very first time, which is the prologue here. In New York, this is the first sentence of the book. In New York, you can get anything delivered. Such, anyway, is the principle I'm operating on. It's the middle of summer, the middle of life. I love that. I mean, the middle of summer, the middle of life, it kind of has resonances of Dante, it sort of catches the moment. I mean, like, I think that there is a real rhythm here, and so the reason I picked this in part is because it kind of concentrates the conflict, but also because I'm wondering, I mean, do you feel that? Is that sort of, when I say that, do you think you're crazy, or do you think that it is actually a rhythm that like feels kind of, I don't know, simpatico to me?
I was reading a lot of Saul Bellow, and Bellow has a little trick that I think of as like the old 1-2 or the high-low. This kind of swing where even in a sentence he can go from very kind of, part of why he can wrestle big thoughts into his books is that he can go from something he read as an undergraduate at the University of Chicago to some piece of Yiddish he picked up on the streets of Montreal at 8 years old, and like pack it into the same sentence, and it has this wonderful sort of chewy, demotic quality. And that way of swinging from high to low, or from the general to the particular and back again, within a sentence or a paragraph or a chapter or a whole section of the novel, did become kind of something I was after. It don't mean a thing if it ain't got that swing.
Yeah, no joke. Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you about your own book. It struck me in listening to you describe mine that many of the descriptors you were using could equally be applied to your own book.
I was trying to go for that.
Yeah, I thought it was kind of a Mad Lib thing. Where you take an introduction and just change the titles. But you have, but you managed to do it all in only 271 pages, which I think makes you much more.
But it feels like 750 also.
So this book too is an epic. In the space of 3 days, on this kind of fascinating and nearly enchanted universe, which is this archipelago off Maine, Seven Island and its sisters, you managed to kind of tap into all of the energies and tensions of a different moment in American history, which is sort of there are many heights of the Cold War, I guess, the Cuban Missile Crisis, or the Soviets testing the bomb. But this is really zooming in on what I think of as like the apogee of nuclear paranoia, spy paranoia, too many secrets, and the secrets are institutional. We have characters here who have been employed by the CIA and have been covert operatives overseas, but then it's also sort of like filtered into their personal lives, and you manage to concatenate all that together in a really extraordinary way, in an extraordinarily efficient, from my point of view, way. But having heard you talk about the book at Watching Booksellers, one thing that I wasn't prepared for, I was ready to kind of go to this we spend some time in Maine in the summers, and I was ready to go to some of these places that I've imagined, you know, the golden retriever and the mall tennis ball and the old emphysematic Volvo station wagon. This kind of waspy, you know, world of privilege that I grew up outside of, but kind of looked upon with some fascination. But as I read the book, as I was saying in the green room before, I think the world you create actually has a back door into something far more strange and interesting and almost mythological. There's this world that this novel occupies, even though it may be only 7 miles in diameter, could easily take up, I mean, maybe this is just me talking thousands and thousands of pages. So I'm wondering if you could read this passage that introduces us to Seven Island through the eyes of a character named John Wilkie, and this is very early in the book.
Trigger warning if you've never been to Maine. So just to quickly summarize the book, I mean, the way that I talk about it, I one time did an event where I had 90 seconds to describe the book to booksellers, and I said this is a book about a guy named Jim Hilsinger who's been recently expelled from the CIA on suspicion of treason, and he puts his 12-year-old son on a nearby island wilderness one summer during the Cold War for 24 hours by himself. That's the kind of basic thing. There's a lot of American history, I hope, and a lot of family history that flows into and out of that, and maybe I'll talk a little bit about how some of that came to be. But one of the people in here who I've heard described as a sort of a Nick Carraway figure is a guy named John Wilkie, who's I don't know how many of you remember or were around for. In the 60s, there were a lot of these Wall Street law firms that were kind of holding pens for people who would go in and out of the government. Sullivan and Cromwell and Simpson Thatcher and a bunch of them like that. Alan Dulles, for example, who founded the CIA, was somebody who had been at those firms. So John Wilkie is part of a firm called Keene Wilkie that his father founded, and he has the privilege or the burden of being a friend with both families who occupy Seven Islands. So there's only two families on the island, and it's a gigantic 1,500-acre island. He has been he's been twice, it turns out, but the first time he comes reluctantly because it's so far to get to. And so he arrives, and there's only one boat a day that takes you from the dock to the actual island, and he misses it, so he has to spend the night in a dreadful motel, and then he comes back the next day. He gets on the boat. The boat moved out of the harbor into the bay, past the color wheel of lobster buoys, past huge cloud formations, ever deeper it seemed into the salt air. Soon the island speck divided, clarified, gained contrast. From nowhere, miles of woods now extended in two directions. He couldn't see where they ended, and it struck him that Seven Island was much bigger than he had imagined. A clearing emerged from the haze, then a dock from the clearing. Two houses, one white and one yellow, sat high up on a grassy hill. Outbuildings and a barn were scattered around, all of them painted that electric red that Wilkie had only ever seen in Maine. When the Heron, that's the boat, landed on the Seven dock and the lines were down, Wilkie stepped carefully out of the boat. Majestic cliffs rose up behind him. Birds called. A flock of sheep tumbled down the hill, and the smell of cut grass and smoke ran alongside or underneath the ethereal salt. The sun was hot and the wind cool. He had never in all his life been anywhere so beautiful. Against his better judgment, he decided that this place was real, and he was instantly and savagely nostalgic. Someday, he thought, you will have to leave this place. Wilkie was due to stay 4 nights, but it would never be enough. From the beginning, from that first step onto the dock, Seven Island projected you forward into a barren future without itself, a mainland world, and the only souvenir of the trip was this premonition of your fantastic loss. It would not be insane, Wilkie thought, to wish that you would never come at all.
So I think those paragraphs do a wonderful job of sort of infecting us with the anticipatory nostalgia that seems to shroud this place like a morning fog. And what I wanted to ask you about it, the reason I chose it, I'm just curious. I think it's sometimes of a work of art. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Marcel Duchamp's ready-mades, but they were these objects, sculptural objects that he would cobble together. And one of the most famous, obviously, is the urinal. But one of them that's always stuck to me is the bottom is a stool and the top is a bicycle fork, and he sort of put these things together and said, "This is art." And I think a lot of the novelist's work is finding these connections between two things that don't seem to go together and trying to articulate how they're part of a whole. So here you have, on one hand, the idol that is set an island, and then on the other, whatever is the opposite of an idol is what I imagine life in the CIA and the Cold War must have been. And I'm wondering, basically, how these things came to you as the material for a book. I'm specifically curious about whether one of them arrived before the other, or whether they arrived together. And I'm very interested to know where your fascination with the spy stuff and where your fascination with islands off of Maine come from.
Yeah. Well, thanks for not calling the book a urinal. I guess there's a couple different answers to that. And one of them is personal, and so I come from two parents, and one of them is my mother was a sort of lapsed debutante from suburban Pittsburgh, and my father was an immigrant from Hungary. He came to this country in 1950, having left Hungary in 1945, a few steps ahead of the advancing Red Army, and it's a ridiculous story. He lived for a while at his father's mistress's house, and it goes on and on. But so on the one hand, I've been both inside and outside of this kind of waspy world, and I've had some pretty good luck of being at some pretty remarkable properties, I guess, in Maine and elsewhere. And
This is via your mom's debutante?
No, just via growing up in Philadelphia and going to college in Connecticut and so forth. So, but I do think that my mother, because my mother hated this world. My parents were basically like this. They were an ex. They crossed for about 2 years here, and then that was about it.
She wanted out, and he wanted in.
Exactly. He was like, "Yes, you're my ticket in." She was like, "Yes, you're my ticket out." And they're not together anymore. But so I've always felt both inside and outside of this, and in some ways it was my dad who loved this world. Who he grew up in Trenton. He lived in an orphanage for a couple of years. He came ahead of his parents. They lived in Trenton back when Trenton really was, making what the world was taking, as the bridge has it, instead of eating what the world was excreting, which my dad would say later. And he fell in love with this world almost instantly, though, and he wound up getting a scholarship to Princeton, where he was kind of on the outside of things a little bit, I think it's fair to say. And then he wound up going to Harvard Law School and kind of, if you met him today, you would think this is a guy who had grown up in this world his whole life. He managed to so completely take it on board, as opposed to my mother, who one time, a woman kind of edged close to her at a Little League game in Philadelphia one time and said, "Aren't you Bonnie Roberts from the Cinderella Ball in Pittsburgh?" And my mom got up and left. So there was that, and one of the things about I went to college at Yale, and I was in the English department at Yale, and one of the things that one was very conscious of being in the English department at Yale, and when I was the late 1980s, early 1990s, was that there had been an immense number of, in the old days, the English department at Yale was actually a big recruitment grounds for the CIA. Norman, who would have thought?
Is this why you majored in English at Yale?
It is. Well, I had flat feet, so it didn't happen. But,
could you tell us if it happened?
I could tell you, but I wouldn't. But James Angleton, who is a name some of you may know, was the longtime head of counterintelligence at the CIA, had actually graduated from Yale, I think in 1941, and had started a literary magazine that published Ezra Pound and Archibald MacLeish. It was kind of a big deal for an undergraduate to do, and he was somebody that one heard about, and this guy Norman Holmes Pearson, who actually, we are told, launched the study of American studies in American universities, and he was at Yale. So there was, those are always names I knew, and I was always interested in the way that intelligence was never definite, and that one had to one had to kind of take so many steps from such a small piece of information. It's the same way that fractional banking works, if you want to get really sexy about it. But I think that's also the way that poetry works, I think, in some ways. I mean, if you read Wallace Stevens or the great poets, I think, take such a small slice of reality and make it seem so large. And I think that is something that has in common with intelligence. So I've always been interested in that. And on the level of this book, it really, I wish I had a better explanation than that. I took 10 years to actually kind of like sketch out this world, and I wasn't sure when it was actually going to be, when I was going to be ready, when it was going to be time to start actually writing the book. And what I realized I was waiting for was for a story to present itself where intelligence and Maine and all these things somehow could merge. And it took me a while to get there, but what's weird to me in retrospect is that the sign of this was coming up with the names for the characters. This felt really decisive to me, and it's a thing that drives me crazy in books sometimes when I feel like they get the names wrong. Like I mean, we've talked about Henry James. We disagree about Henry James. I think Henry James gets his names wrong all the time. It drives me nuts. And so when there was a moment when I kind of finally, I got Hillsinger pretty quickly, but it took me a while to figure out what the other name should be. And I actually took a friend of mine's dad dying in a plane crash. His name was Billy Knight. I remember thinking, God, that's kind of really nice, kind of like rhythm to it, Billy Knight. And then we wound up being Billy Quick. Hillsinger and Quick are the names of the two families. And it feels like it could be a real firm. And so I felt like that's where I could start working.
So for you, just this side note, I'm reading a novel I really love, but one of the characters' names is Zachariah, and it has one too many syllables, and it's driving me crazy. But so for you, this, Maine, Yale, debutante balls, and all of that was always in some way connected with, or had a tentacle into the world of, intelligence and covert ops and those sorts of things.
Well, I mean, in the 1960s, one of the things that is interesting to me about this period of time is that it was, foreign policy was a very prestigious, very well-regarded, very well
white,
attended,
very male.
Well, this was the tragic, the ridiculous flaw of it was that everyone was white, everyone was male, everyone was from free schools. It was not sustainable. But with that said, I think that the sense of public service was good. I think we can say that what they were defending was inherently problematic. But to me, I wish that there was. I wish that it felt like a real option to me to go into the government. Right now, I feel like it does not feel that way to me, and it did not feel that way to me when I graduated from college. But when my father did, he was somebody who actually thought that the highest thing you can do would be to go into the government, and particularly in the State Department, particularly in the Department and CIA potentially. And so there was a real kind of, I think at least these people thought of it as a nobility of purpose. And if you want some evidence, I recommend to you Alan Dulles' book about the Marshall Plan. And if you want to know about a time when public figures wrote books that were incredibly good, that would be one to read. But there was a real sense of sacrifice and of making the world better. We can quibble, we can argue about whether or not the CIA actually accomplished that, but I think that the goal was good and one that I admire. And I think that the stakes were relatively high. My grandfather, just as an example, believe it or not, in the 70s there were Hungarian radio stations in New Jersey. And he entered an essay contest to write about, what America has meant to me type thing. He won it. He won the essay contest, and it's like that old joke about where first prize is a trip to Cleveland and second prize is 2 trips to Cleveland. The prize for winning the essay contest was to go back to Hungary, which he had left, and my grandmother said absolutely not under no circumstances. And he got there, and he had a KGB minder, and they said, Dr. Nagy, we of course have a dossier on you, and there is a death sentence that has been in the dossier, but we're not going to bother you. Have a great trip. And he did. So, but he was lucky. And so, I mean, I think that the stakes were high, and the way that one has to think about intelligence reminds me of the way that one thinks about literature. So finding a way to kind of merge those things felt very compelling to me. But can we talk about Field Guide?
Sure.
So this is actually the UK version. I had a version control problem in my house, but this is the Field Guide to the North American Family, which was actually Garth's first published book. It came out originally,
I think 07.
07.
Yeah.
And I've heard you talk about it a couple times, including at Watching Booksellers. And one of the things, it's much shorter than Sam. I don't have a scale here, but there are definitely continuities. But before we talk about them, I mean, I'd be curious to hear you read the passage here. One of the ways that the book is organized is that there are kind of larger red letter concepts here. So, for example, the first couple are adulthood, angst, boredom, chemistry, commitment. And each of them have a fictional can we call it an illustration? Is that fair? Or
sure.
Fictional accompaniment. And when I asked Garth what he had started with, he said, well, he pointed me towards this particular passage, which starts at boredom. So maybe you would read that and start there.
Sure. Jackie roams the near-empty lower field with a handheld video camera, chasing the electrons in the broody gray air, the mist so fine it might be imaginary. Brake lights stream beyond the chain-link fence. On the next field over, the varsity football team is practicing, and the war chants of teenagers puncture the pressurized quiet. A flock of gray-white birds is flushed from the hedge that separates the two fields. She chases them, her ponytail whipping around, her skirt and shirt too thin for the weather. She is narrating. Today I lost a tooth. She captures the birds as they tumble in a dizzying fractal into the air, colors shifting light to dark. They churn over a swimming pool that's been covered for winter and dwindle to dots in the sky. They're running away. They don't like me, Jackie says. Trees scattering the lens as she gallops away from the bushes. The grass is brown. She spots a mud puddle. This is from when the trucks come across the field for a delivery. Now she lies down in the dry grass and aims the camera toward her face. This is what it's like to be a bug. Not very exciting. She turns the camera around and positions her stuffed lion in front of the lens. It flops over. She reaches out to make an adjustment, but it flops again. An empty sandbox forms a backdrop. This is Alphonse, she says. Say hello, Alphonse. Hello. Behind him, that's the sandbox where I played at lunch today. I made a castle. Tomorrow I'm going to play kickball. That's my video journal for today. The end. The microphone drones dimly with white noise, and the camera continues to run, capturing the sandbox and the procession of blurry taillights far behind the flopped lion, whose mane is accreting fine raindrops. The voice cuts in again. Oh, and also, today my parents got divorced. The end. The footage ends abruptly.
So each of the passages is just about a page or less in some cases, and then each passage also has a picture. And the pictures are wonderful and extremely evocative, I think, and the vignettes are wonderful. They're told from different perspectives, and they kind of amount to kind of impressionism, I think, of this particular story. You said to me that this was commissioned by an art publisher. I'd like to hear more about that.
That's a very.
I feel like that's like sort of my girlfriend lives in Niagara Falls.
Right.
No, but I guess my real question is, did this already exist? If you had not been commissioned by the art publisher, would you have written this anyway? in this way? And I'm curious about this.
I think so. I mean, I should say just descriptively about the book. It's essentially your book. Mine is 200 pages and the CIA. Step's book is structured around the tension between these two families who sort of live side by side, each alike in dignity, but don't really get along, and occasionally someone defects from one family to the other, and they're sort of stuck on this island. Here, the actual story is these two families, same deal, at the same age, they've got kids, and their next door neighbors in the island are stuck on Long Island, which is not quite, it's not quite Seven Island. You're not quite infected with the possibility of its loss when you travel to Long Island. But the way that it's a very, in a lot of ways, it's a very conventional, sort of like almost willfully domestic story, and then, me at 24, I'm trying to couple that with something quite unconventional, which is to tell the story in the form almost of a dictionary. So they're, rather than organize the story chronologically, I'm pulling out sort of themes and ideas and then arranging those alphabetically. And my idea, again, this is me at 24, is that you can read the chapters in whatever order you want. You can skip around the way you would in a birding book or something. So how this had come about, and I think it would have been written had it not been commissioned, but I had moved to Washington, D.C. In the summer of 2001 as part of my failed attempt to get to New York from college. So my then girlfriend, now wife, had applied to various graduate schools, and she'd actually gotten into Columbia, but the Columbia admission procedure is to just send you a bill. That's how you know you got into Columbia. Whereas she got some financial aid to go to the University of Maryland outside of DC, and I thought, okay, DC, that's a city I know and like, and we'll kind of bide our time there and then make our assault on New York when she's got her degree. But I'd been there for 6 weeks and had just gotten my first job. This was my first taste of adult life when September 11th happened. And for me, as for many, it's a cliche to say, well, that changed everything. But I think for many people, it did. And then, I mean, personally, psychologically, domestically, civically, politically, there's just so much that is not the same. And one of the personal changes for me is that I had become convinced that this weirdly remunerative job I'd stumbled into at 23 years old was a total joke, and I wasn't doing anything for anyone. So I quit my job and I went to go teach elementary school, because that was what Wittgenstein had done or something. And
what else did you do that Wittgenstein did?
And that's it. That's the beginning and end of the list of overlap. But for one thing, it gave me, I had just sort of started writing short stories in a serious way. I'd always thought I was a poet. And all of a sudden, something had kind of quickened in my fiction writing, even as my poetry died. And I learned something from watching the kids watch. I mean, as a 7-year-old or an 8-year-old, they just see the world. Henry James says, be a person on whom nothing is lost. That's Lambert straight there with Little Bill, and both of them character names you would abhor.
Right, unfortunately.
How do you be an artist? Be a person on whom nothing is lost. A 7-year-old is a person on whom nothing is lost. They see everything. So I was kind of writing at night, and I was going in and teaching them and watching them watch. And I was also getting this weird access to their personal dramas, because you're their teacher. So this, I was kind of writing down these little vignettes of things I was seeing, and one day I watched, the teacher said, you gotta see this, and she showed me this video that this little girl had made on the day that her parents got divorced. And that was basically the video, and I went and I wrote it down. And I was like, there's something there. So I started collecting these little vignettes, and I'm like, how do they fit together? What's tying them together? And I separately had this title, which is a field guide. it's something like Field Guide to the North American Family, something like that I really liked. And a friend of mine who's an editor at a now defunct literary magazine who had published a short story of mine said, you know, we want to do this little series of books, like a little library. And do you have anything that can be a really short book? And I just thought, well, I've got this title. And I was like, and I've got these vignettes. And then the two sort of...
Did you know them already? Have they read your short fiction? Or
Yeah, they published a short story.
They published it, okay.
And, you know, apparently liked it or thought it was enough of a sap to give them more work for $100 or whatever they paid, which I totally was. And, you know, it was like the bicycle, fork, and stool, you know, fusing in that moment. And I spent, you know, the next 6 weeks sort of like literally on the rug with scissors, you know, trying to arrange these vignettes and gradually moving towards this idea of open structure.
Did the abstract, did the kind of rubrics like boredom, tenderness, etc. Was that all there at the beginning, or did that come later as a kind of organizing principle?
Well, I knew they would have to have titles, and then I assumed that most people would read the book straight through. So I started fudging the titles a little. Like I'd make something an A if I wanted it near the beginning of the book. But you know, you can also, it's cross-referenced. There are all these directions in the book. You know, I love these choose-your-own-adventure books when I was a kid, and I love the idea of getting to the end of the page and having a choice, as the characters do. And so there are all these little cues on. You know, you could flip the next page, or you could jump to freedom, you know, and move over here like that. And initially, I wrote the picture captions, but I had no pictures. I was like, a field guide should have pictures, but where am I going to get pictures?
I love the captions too. The captions are fantastic.
Yeah, they predate the things that they're captions for. So I had a friend that I tried to conscript into, he's a great photographer, I tried to conscript him into supplying images. And I learned a lot about photography in doing that. My idea that you can just go out one weekend and like shoot 63 great photographs. Eric, who's here as a photographer, knows is not at all how it works. So eventually, you know, in conjunction with the press, we settled on this idea of like actually recruiting a bunch of different photographers to give kind of different visual textures that would mimic the kind of different voices you get in the story. But I want to ask you a question, which is, this is your own multidisciplinary question, but you were actually a filmmaker and playwright first. And I heard you say that you spent 10 years sketching out this world that you were then going to, we were waiting to turn it into the book, which suggests that at that point you knew this was going to be a novel and not a film or a play. And I'm just kind of interested in how that transition worked.
Yeah. Well, so I got out of college and I worked on a movie that was an independent film in Philadelphia. And during that period of time, a friend of mine who was in law school called me up and said, hey, I'm in law school, I hate it. I'm not going to be a lawyer. I want to make a movie and I want you to write it and direct it. So it's a pretty good offer.
Very similar. You were conscripted.
Yeah, and so I did, and we wound up making it in that kind of by hook or by crook way that people did this in the early 90s. That all kind of stopped somehow around 1995, but which is right around when we made the movie. But I loved everything about making this movie. I loved everything about making movies. I did not like writing screenplays.
Did you feel like a filmmaker?
Well, yes, because what I began to realize, and we had a guy in the movie named John Glover who had just won, who's an absolutely wonderful actor, who had just won the Tony Award for Best Actor for this play called Love, Valor, Compassion, which was from Terrence McNally. And this guy took me seriously, which was really such a terrible miscalculation on his part. But what I started to realize, and this was something that was confirmed then by some of the reading I did of Lee Strasberg, which has been someone I've read a lot, which is that if you really understand what you are, the material, actors will take you seriously, and oddly enough, so will technicians, so will directors of photography. And this is one of the reasons why I think it's actually possible for first-time filmmakers to make good movies. But I did that, and it was great, and everything was great about it, except that it didn't really go anywhere. through a really strange fluke, it did wind up in the Museum of Modern Art's permanent collection, but it did not set the world on fire in a career sense. And I tried to get another movie going. This was very cheap, and everyone said, you know, we love this. You are a wonderful writer. Do you have a horror movie? And this just happened over and over and over again. And so I just came to the conclusion that independent film had died basically overnight. And I was very frustrated by the whole thing. And so I said, you know what, I'm going to do something that's exactly the opposite of this. And there's a 10-minute play contest at Actors Theater at the Humana Festival, which is at Actors Theater in Louisville, which is one of the really good regional theaters. And so I wrote a farce for the National 10-Minute Play Contest about two guys who are California Highway Patrol officers who decided that they're going to take their law enforcement duties into the method acting realm. I loved writing it. It wound up being a finalist for that thing. It wound up getting produced at Actors Theater in Louisville, and I wound up being in a room full of people who were laughing at the play. And I'm sure no one in the room other than my wife has ever seen the movie, but the movie is very serious. And so the idea of suddenly there being laughter in an artistic context felt very exciting to me, very strange. And so I thought, okay, great. Then what's been happening here is that I've been trying to make these serious movies, but in reality, I should be making comedies for the stage. This was one of a number of really dumb choices that I made, really. And so I spent 5-6 years.
That's where the real money is.
Yeah.
What I really thought was they're chasing this film chimera.
I thought they have to make it, right? It's easy, right? It's easy. It's not, and we can have a longer conversation about whether or not the American theater is broken, which I think is. But but what wound up happening was I kept writing more and more monologues, and I kept writing these interior things, and finally I was like, you know what, I'm just fooling myself here. What I really want to do is to write a novel, but it felt like, but all of a sudden by saying I'm going to write a novel, I was in the realm of Harold Bloom, you know, and the kind of the Yale English department, and the kind of are things great, or are they just okay, or are they second rate, or whatever. And so I had to kind of move past that a little bit, and yet this was something that I've been intending to do for a long time. And so finally, I cleared the decks, and it took me a long time to get the world right and to get the names right, etc. But then I finally did it.
This is one of the great. Nobody ever talks about this, but you know, as a novelist, it is very strange. You either have to convince yourself that you have to have this crazy hubris that, like, you might sit down and write something that can, I mean, basically anything that's not Virginia Woolf is just wasting time, right? 100%. So you either have to have this hubris where you convince yourself that you can, you know, do something on that level, despite all evidence to the contrary, or you have to get really comfortable with wasting time, or both. But I guess your career in stage comedy had prepared you for.
It was all very ironic at the beginning. No, I think that that is one of the privileges of any artistic endeavor, is that you have the opportunity to do something great. And this sounds very cheesy, but I remember walking across Washington Square Park one of the first days that I had moved to New York, and if you've done it recently, there's that on the arch there it says there's an inscription. I wonder if anyone's ever read it other than me, but it says, "Let us raise a standard to which the wise and honest can repair. The event is in the hand of God." And I think that there is something to that. Every day when you sit down to write, you can write a sentence that is great, and you won't. And there will be other problems with your work. And I should say, I mean, one of the things that I experienced with this book, and I feel like it's important to kind of demystify some of this a little bit, because I was at an event at one point with a writer who shall be nameless, but where she said, "Oh my God, it was so great! I just wrote this book, and then it sold for so much money, and then in Hollywood, and it's just been great. It's been a great ride." And I remember thinking, "My God, that has not been my experience at all." I wrote the first draft of this, which entirely happened on Seven Island over a 3-day period. And it went out. It took me a long time to find an agent. I sent out 62 queries to agents, went up with 2 offers, picked one. We sent the thing out to publishers. Nobody bought it. And it turned out that one of the people who got sent to was a guy who I'd gone to college with, and we had a long conversation, and he said, "Look, here's the thing. I'm not going to buy your book." Thanks. But I think that you know more about, he talked to me for a while about what was going on, you know more about this, what's going on in this world than I do, and that's a problem. And I was furious at this. I mean, it just felt like, there's so many different defensive layers that you go through at this point, but ultimately, he was right, and I knew he was right, and I just had to kind of admit it and then say, okay, how do we fix this? And so what that wound up looking like was adding in a story at the historical part of my book, which is told in italics. It runs from 1941 through just months before the actual events happen in the book. And it took me a long time to find a way to tell that part of the story in a way that didn't feel purely expositional. Because one of the things that you learn, this is sort of an answer to your other question, in film and in theater, is that there is nothing more painful in the world than sitting in a room full of people who are watching your movie or your play where there is a bad, doesn't matter how long it is, a bad 5 seconds of dialogue where there's unnecessary exposition or there is no tension or there is whatever. And I feel like I had potentially learned that lesson a little too well. And what I had done was I had cut off the oxygen from the story by not giving it more historical context. And this was kind of painful because on the one hand you think to yourself, hey, look, I've learned these lessons, I've done the work over here, surely it's going to apply. And in fact, as my friend said to me, and I felt both grateful and irritated, he said, look, it's a different contract with the reader. And that was a very painful way to learn that lesson.
I mean, not just that. I mean, there's this weird thing. I just started teaching again after a few semesters off. There's all kinds of stuff that people will throw at you, either in a classroom setting or the books that you're reading will throw at you, like show don't tell, and iceberg. This whole thing about iceberging. That's all about exposition too, in a way. But ultimately, of all people, I came across Henry James saying this. He's like, okay, we're after elegance and perfection and scrupulousness, but I'll chuck that all overboard in the name of intensity. So you could be like following, you can be doing all the craft things, everything's in perfect taste and and exquisite, and you never get that bad 5 seconds of dialogue, but the thing is dead. Or on the other hand, you can have like Sister Carrie by Theodore Dreiser, which has a clumsy something in every sentence, and yet you can't put the thing down. It's a barn burner.
Or Balzac. I mean, you read Balzac and you're like, man, my God, this is just dreadful writing, some of it, and yet it has this kind of energy.
Well, I blame the translation. The translation is terrible. It's amazing.
Yeah, I mean, because ultimately that was one of the things that I was taught, I think, accurately by filmmaking, was that you need to go for energy, not for art. Because I kind of came into, at age 23, into making a film thinking, oh, Bergman, everything's going to be perfect, it's going to be amazing. And then somebody showed me, the art department of the movie showed me Tarkovsky's films. I don't know how many people have seen them, but it showed me Tarkovsky films after I had made the movie, which honestly is about the nastiest thing you can do to somebody.
No, actually it's the second nastiest. The nastiest is to show them in Tarkovsky movies right before they start shooting.
Yeah, well, I mean, no one has ever done anything with a camera as well as Tarkovsky has, but this idea, though, it has stayed with me, and that finding the energy is so much more important than finding the beauty, and that the beauty is actually irrelevant, or is at best a kind of an after effect. And and I love this quote from Louis Kahn, who's another Philadelphia resident of note, which is, even a brick wants to be something. And I think that for me, that's one of the big tasks of the editing process, is saying, okay, really honestly, like, what is this? And trying to be honest about it. And if what it is, and I think that this is one of the things that I really admire, the incredibly deep and insanely passionate, like, YA and crime and romance, the sort of genre communities which have driven, bestsellers and all kinds of things with almost no media support. What they're really good at is saying, hey, you know what, here's what we're trying to do. We're trying to make people excited, or we're trying to make them cry, or we're trying to do one thing, and they are very straightforward about it. And I feel like those of us who are writing what we think of as literary fiction, sometimes, or at least I should say, I sometimes lose track of these more basic things, and so
I was just going to start an argument, but I think
Pose it as a question.
Sorry, I hate to interrupt and be like the interloper. Would anyone like to ask a question?
So I'm interested in the time that you each chose, right? Which you couldn't possibly have been alive for. You know, one was 1964 and one was about 1974, and why you decided to go back into the past.
But here's the parallel: is that you're about 9 years older than I am, 10 years older.
47.
So you're 1974 is 1964. In other words, there are times that we weren't really alive for, but that are like just out of reach. And I came to think in writing the novel that it's remembering what it's like to be a little kid upstairs when your parents are having a dinner party. There's candlelight and there's glasses clinking and silverware making noise and laughter, and it's just out of reach and you don't understand. It's just over your head, but like if there was anything in the world you wanted to understand or have access to, it's whatever is going on down there. And I think for me, I had such a profound sense as a kid growing up, in the Reagan era. I mean, weirdly, I really felt that as a kid. I was like, it's 1985, this is Ronald Reagan's America. And I had a strong sense of that as a reaction to something that was just out of view. All of these, the kind of revanchist spirit of the 80s were a reaction to something anarchic and disorderly but filled with potential that was just out of view and had gone wrong somehow. And I spent a lot of time, even as a kid, trying to figure out what that might be from the echoes that it was sending off, like a bat, with sonar or something. And I wonder whether any of that.
Well, I think there's a couple of levels to it for me. I mean, one of them is that I will confess to having done the math on when Tolstoy wrote War and Peace and when the events he was writing about actually were, and I think it's about between 50 and 60 years, 70 years maybe. And so I think that there is for example, like I remember reading, which is the Francis one where we talked about George Bush, it's freedom, right? Yeah. Remember reading that and thinking, this George W. Bush as a word has so many ramifications for me that the author basically has no control over it. And so to me, going back a certain period of time meant that you can actually choose what to foreground and what to explain in certain ways. And so the associations are not as great while you still maintain the really compelling kind of superstructure of the whole thing. But that's very abstract. But more concretely, to me, I was born in 1970. The Berlin Wall came down in 1989. So basically, I was baked, by the Cold War. And my father, as I think I mentioned, was in some respects a pure product of the Cold War. And to me, it was partly a question of how can I explain the emotional context of all of this, so of the emotional context of my father's complete absence of emotional affect. How can I explain where we've ended up as a culture? I think that all those things kind of started around then. I think that because to me, and another thing that has been very influential for me has been the French historical school of Annales. There's a particular thing in French where they talk about mentalities a lot, and one of the things that they say is that mentalities change incredibly slowly, so that you have cars that are measured in horsepower, for example, would be one example, right? To me, I think that World War II was a real turning point in how this country thought about itself. I think that we went from thinking of ourselves as kind of scrappy outsiders. I think that informed to some extent the way the decisions were made in coming into World War I. I think that in World War II, coming out of it, and obviously Eisenhower warned against the military-industrial complex, etc. But I think that to me, this was when we became aware of the possibility of world significance, and I think that was once that happened, And I think that the 50s, on a foreign policy level, were very much consumed by McCarthyism and losing China, and there was a bunch of other things. But when you see, if you look at, for example, I really recommend Daniel Ellsberg's memoir called Secrets, which is about it's actually more than about the Pentagon Papers, it's about his work in the Department of Defense before that. But what you see from that is that the consciousness and the kind of the sense of being able to engage on this worldwide level was really new and was intoxicating in some ways. And so to me, that was really beginning in 1964. And so to me, that what is happening in 1964 is kind of the primal scene of where we ended up with the fall of the Berlin Wall.
And I just want to say one thing that's both resonant in what you're saying and kind of the opposite of what it sounds like you're saying, which is, the thing you notice with Tolstoy isn't just Tolstoy, like the debtor's prison that's the setting of Little Dorrit, or the Chancery Court from Bleak House, or the Land of Freedom acts that frame Middlemarch. Those are all events that occurred 30 to 40 years before the author is writing thing. It's like very common throughout the history of the novel. And part of what the other thing that it does is, when Tolstoy writes War and Peace, he's not really writing about the Napoleonic Wars. Like, he's writing about his Russia that he's living in then. Like, Middlemarch is a profoundly contemporary document, as so is Bleak House, so is Little Dorrit. So in some ways, the 30 or 40 year remove gives you like a kind of a mask that you can dress up the current age in. You can talk about George W. Bush better in fiction, at least in our historical moment, by writing about the Cold War than you can by writing about George Bush. And so this thing that you're saying about their father's distant emotional affect, like, that's not purely a historical thing, that's also a universal enough thing to make it very present. And that's why your book doesn't feel like historical fiction, and I hope neither does mine. No knock on historical fiction, but I didn't sense you trying to just be true to the time period. I sense you trying to make a picture of stuff that mattered to you now, filtered through, a kind of fantastical version of then.
It's a fair point. I'd also say this, that I definitely did not set out to write a topical novel. But I feel like events have kind of overtaken it to some extent. There's a thing that happened in the CIA in the 1960s where there was two defectors, and this is in the background of my book, and somebody came over and they said, here's what's happening. They're going to send a second defector to discredit what I'm telling you. And then a second defector came, and that defector wound up being incarcerated and arguably tortured. And I'm actually currently, it looks like, suing the CIA for access to some of those memos. But basically, there was a moment when this all happened. And the first guy, the first defector, said, "Look, I can't tell you who the mole is, but there's a mole at the CIA, and his name begins with K." That's all I had. That's all I said. And so all the files, this actually happened, all the files of people whose names began with K got pulled. They all got run through the ringer. A bunch of them got thrown out of the CIA. And and when you say this, that this whole thing was predicated on somebody saying the mole's name begins with K, people laugh, right? If you told Alan Dulles that the President of the United States had given Israeli intelligence in the Oval Office to the ambassador and the foreign minister of Russia, what do you think he would have said? The only thing that looks sillier from what was happening during the Cold War in the CIA is what the CIA would think was happening now.
I texted before I said, no Trump. No, you can't.
Any other questions?
When you know you have one. Hi. I'm wondering for both of you, when you started these novels, did you know you were going to write a 900-page book? Did you know where you were going, and how did that journey shift and change and turn for you along the way?
With actually both of these books, I had a sense of what they were gonna, one of the first things that comes to me is a sense of this weird sense of shape or form that I almost can't write until I have, and I very much had the sense with City on Fire that it was going to be about like a Victorian triple-decker The way they printed books in the Victorian age, the reason all of Dickens's novels are like exactly the same length is that they're triple deckers. They're 3-volume novels, and each volume is like 280 pages or something like that. So I had the sense that it was going to be that size, and it ended up, right on target. As for, and I kind of had the very beginning and the very end. As for what was going to be in the middle, that was 7 years of writing, just figuring that out. But I think, one of the things I learned about novel writing early on is it's always a good strategy to kind of, start close to the end of the events and then break off at a certain point and then kick the very end as far down the field as you can, and the rest of the novel you're just running and trying to catch the ball you sent out.
I was completely, had no idea whether what I was starting was going to be 12 pages or 30 pages. I hoped it was going to be a full-length novel, but I really wasn't sure. Because I too had an idea what was going to happen at the end, and at the beginning, but I wasn't sure whether it was going to be enough to kind of justify what that might look like. And I have a really hard time. I mean, I'm working on something now, and I feel like it could be anywhere from 7 to 7,000 pages, and it's actually kind of daunting not to know. I wish I had Garth's sort of premonition of form.
But actually what you want, you don't want to know the end of Act 3 in the 3-act structure. You want the beginning of Act 3, and then you want to break off a piece of that and use it somewhere in Act 1. And what you're looking for is what happens between Act 1 and Act 3, and then I think, at least if you're me, you want to leave the end of Act 3 a mystery even to yourself, because otherwise you end up with the whole thing being too kind of relentlessly driven toward a point. So one of the joys of novel writing, especially really long novels, is finally getting to the end and getting to know yourself. Oh my God, that's what happened. And if you have that feeling, maybe some of that gets transmitted to the reader.
I said just as sort of a diagonal to your question. I mean, one of the things that I liked a lot about writing short fiction, I only written 2 short stories, but also about plays and screenplays, is that you really can have a very clear sense of what's working and what isn't working and why. I mean, the mechanics of them are much clearer because they're much shorter, and you can kind of keep the whole thing in your brain. And it was immensely frustrating to me, to this sense of having completely lost control of like what amount of information was necessary, where were we exactly. And so I found the thing that I would do a lot would be I would re-outline the book very often, just to kind of remind myself of where we were and what was happening, what had and hadn't happened. And one of the things that's funny about when you get to the point of actually the publisher has committed to publish the book and so forth, nobody cares about that stuff anymore. Everyone, there's no kind of, you feel like there ought to be some kind of shared outlining that you do with your editor, but somehow that never happens, and everyone's kind of just going off their gut, which I guess is what everyone's paid to do. But it was that idea of kind of like having a clear picture of where it's going feels important to me, but it also feels important to me to leave enough out that you give yourself some scope to discover things, because if you don't do that, I feel like that, for me anyway, that kind of generates the sense that I'm kind of like driving myself too hard in terms of what to get through something, which is not what I really want to do.
Okay, any last questions? Okay, then we're going,
I just have a quick question. You mentioned that you went back to teaching. I hope at a higher level than those 7 or 10-year-olds.
Yes, yeah. So I've been teaching in the graduate program in Sarah Lawrence off and on for years now. But everything, I mean, it's the same principles. Everything I learned about, working with a 25-year-old is, I got from working with 7-year-olds. The same. So we're all driven by the same, very few motivations. Would you like to write your idea on the board with the it's amazing. It works.